Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we talk to Bill Woolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association, about whether we'll eventually see Guardians stationed in space, whether the Pentagon needs to shift resources away from other services and to the Space Force, and how much the Space Force will rely on commercial space assets. And then we break down the changing face of foreign policy in the Republican Party, a potential AI backlash, and much more. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Hope you all had a fantastic New Year's Eve. Thanks for spending a little bit of time over the holidays with us here once again. Big show this week and a really good interview coming up with Bill Woolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association, all about the future of the Space Force, the relationship between the Pentagon and commercial assets in space, and a lot more. So stay tuned for that. But before we get there, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here with you for another week. There are several things I'm tracking. First off, being the ongoing attempts by President Trump to generate a peace process and eventual end of war negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. There were theatrics over the past week with Ukrainian President Zelensky meeting with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Both expressed optimism after that meeting, particularly about the prospect of unity between Europe, the U.S., and Ukraine with regard to trying to move the ball forward on the Trump-engineered peace plan. But as hopeful as that might be right now, Ben, it remains just optics. The hard reality is that Russia is not participating in any of these peace talks. The other hard reality is that the Trump plan calls for serious territorial giveaways to Russia. And here's what I found most interesting in recent days. Zelensky seemed to signal at Mar-a-Lago more than he previously had that he personally could live with ceding territory in far eastern Ukraine to Russia. But Zelensky's also now talking openly about how that ceding of territory would only happen if there was some kind of referendum on it in Ukraine, either a national vote accepting the concessions or some kind of parliamentary vote. The question now is whether Trump would get in the way of that or go along with it. I think the initial indications at Mar-a-Lago were that Trump thinks that public opinion in Ukraine is to end the war and that such a referendum would pass. Of course, we're going to be tracking that whole situation closely in the Threat Status daily newsletter going forward, Ben. Next on my radar is the dramatic increase in tensions between China and Taiwan. The Chinese military in recent days engaged in its biggest ever war games, and really just a show of military force around the, I like to call it the U.S.-aligned island democracy of Taiwan. These drills actually encircled Taiwan. Chinese officials also put out statements suggesting that the drills were a direct response to the Trump administration's approval about 2 weeks ago of a massive weapons sale package for the Taiwanese military. For those who don't know, Ben, there are many officials within the U.S. national security community who worry that conflict over Taiwan represents the number one chance or prospect of a military clash between the U.S. and China. In our coverage at Threat Status, we've been careful to point out a couple of things. First, that the Chinese Communist Party government in Beijing has openly threatened to take control of self-governed Taiwan by force, if necessary. Second, Ben, the Trump administration's 2025 national security strategy recently emphasized that the U.S. goal is to deter, quote, conflict over Taiwan, ideally by preserving military overmatch, end quote. So what does that military overmatch look like? It's certainly a good question right now in the wake of these massive Chinese military drills around Taiwan. One could easily argue that the drills were carefully designed to try to generate global public opinion, or at least regional public opinion in the Indo-Pacific, that it's China, not the U.S., that currently holds so-called military overmatch around Taiwan. At the very least, overmatch in the naval realm. But I'm sure there are listeners in the U.S. defense community that would disagree with that, and I'm going to digress for now. And I want to move to one other thing, Ben. I was struck also in recent days by Trump's comments after another meeting at Mar-a-Lago with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in which President Trump openly threatened to, quote, very, very powerful consequences, end quote, if Iran is found to be rebuilding its nuclear program or its ballistic missile program. In off-the-cuff remarks to reporters, Trump said he's heard that Iran was trying to rebuild at different sites from those bombed by U.S. and Israeli forces back in June. The president emphasized, however, Ben, that the Iranian activity has not been confirmed. He also suggested that he wants to negotiate diplomatically with Iran. When asked whether he would support direct U.S.-Iran talks over Iran's nuclear program, Trump said he would support that. So while Iran's nuclear and missile activities were battered and pushed down by U.S. and Israeli bombing back in June, the Iran nuclear issue continues to dominate the U.S.-Iran dynamics. And finally, Ben, it's notable that Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has vowed recently that Tehran does plan to rebuild its nuclear facilities with, quote, greater strength, end quote, although he's also claimed that Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon.
And talked about this very issue with Russian President Putin here just recently, I think not even a day before we hit the record button here. So it's interesting how that dynamic is kind of always still there in the background, even after those U.S. strikes last June. And that plays into one thing I want to zero in on here, Guy, and that's something I'm going to be watching very closely in 2026. The politics of U.S. foreign policy and specifically the use of military force and how that's going to break down inside the Republican Party as we head toward the midterms. And yes, of course, the way too early analysis of the 2028 presidential cycle. I'm an old politics reporter. And so the intersection of national security, foreign policy, and politics is something that always fascinates me. And one of my biggest takeaways from this year, from 2025, was President Trump's approach to using that U.S. military force, as we've talked about many times here in the show. But, for somebody who made his bones, of course, on the political stage, criticizing the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and making clear he wanted to pull back American forces and focus on the homeland, our sphere of influence, if you will, around the Western Hemisphere, around the U.S. He's using U.S. firepower all over the world. There have been more than 100 strikes in Somalia this year, recent operations in Syria, the attacks on the Iranian nuclear sites you just mentioned, Venezuelan drug boat campaign, and now reportedly a strike on a Venezuelan land target, Houthi rebels, strikes in Nigeria against ISIS, and others. So you could argue, I guess, these are isolated strikes, and that's very different than a prolonged ground war like Afghanistan or Iraq. I think there's some truth to that. But I'm curious that whether this, by design or maybe just kind of by chance, sort of births the next iteration of MAGA foreign policy, right? I mean, this isn't just isolationism. It's why Trump has never been in lockstep with Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, for example. But he's also never been totally in line with somebody like Lindsey Graham, one of the party's most outspoken hawks. It's always been hard to kind of pin down exactly where Trump stands in terms of a foreign policy philosophy or doctrine, as we've talked about before on the show, Guy. And, with military action, let's just say for the sake of argument, you've got one side over here, the isolationists, one side over here, the hawks. Now I think it's a little more clear where Trump comes down. The philosophy is that we are opposed to big ground wars, major campaigns on the ground, but we are more than willing, maybe even eager in some cases, to use the full might of the U.S. military, both as a warning and as a tool to achieve a very specific objective: cripple Iran's nuclear program, stop the flow of drugs, halt the killing of Christians in Nigeria. So what does that mean for the politics of 2026 and 2028? That's what I'm curious about. Do both the hawks and the isolationists, the Rand Pauls and the Lindsey Grahams, do they become outliers essentially in the Republican Party? And we have a new breed, perhaps led by J.D. Vance and others, whoever else decides to run for president in the Republican Party, who adopts this approach of essentially what Trump has espoused. We don't want major wars. We're deeply opposed to that philosophically, but we won't think twice about unleashing the U.S. military anywhere in the world at a moment's notice, even if it seems a little bit legally dubious, as in the case of these drug boat strikes, for example. So, there are moments, Guy, in politics where you can kind of sense a shift on a core position or a core tenet of a party. We've seen that a number of times with Trump and where he's taken the Republican Party on a host of different issues. I'm really interested to see in 2026 and beyond whether this sticks and whether this new foreign policy philosophy that he's laid out this year takes root and kind of defines the party as a whole moving forward.
It's really interesting, Ben. I think that there are questions about what the real geopolitical goals are with regard to the Trump administration's approach to global security. Is it about confronting the so-called cranks, the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, maybe plus Venezuela nexus, or is it about using the U.S. military instrument of power just simply to exert U.S. influence in certain regions? It was on December 22, Ben, that we ran a threat status story about the underpinnings of a new Trump foreign policy doctrine and how they're becoming more clear as the president closes out the first year of his second term with a push toward what many are describing as a 19th century style spheres of influence approach that you just mentioned. And this will be exemplified by the administration's focus on Venezuela in the Western Hemisphere, a greater focus on Latin America, and how that's sort of taking center stage. Our own Vaughn Cocaine wrote that story, Ben. Listeners can check it out on the threat status pages.
And we are joined now by Bill Woolf, retired U.S. Air Force officer, more than 2 decades of service, and now the president, CEO, and founder of the Space Force Association. I'm talking to Bill here for the second year in a row, actually, at the Space Power 2025 conference in Orlando, Florida. Bill, it's a pleasure to see you again. Thanks for coming on the Threat Status podcast.
Yeah, I really do appreciate it. Collaboration space, really do appreciate the opportunity to have the discussion.
Let's start here and dive right into this. You announced here at the conference the formation, the unveiling, if you will, of the National Space Power Center. Can you tell our listeners what this center is, why it's needed, what its mission's going to be?
Yeah, great question. And we're really excited about the National Space Power Center for a number of reasons. One, we've got a capability knowledge gap right now in America in that we have the first space native generation that is growing up not knowing a day without space, and they don't understand what those capabilities actually provide to them. More than 50 times a day, people are using space, but they don't interact with the domain, and so they don't realize how critical it is. So the National Space Power Center is a way to allow folks to interact with the space domain, to see the capabilities that are in orbit, to start to work through some of the problem sets that will be presented if we start to lose those capabilities. So think of it as a demonstrator, a collaborative environment, an educational outreach opportunity, an opportunity to do unclassified tabletop exercises, and therefore create products that can help inform policy that we know we're going to need. And so our goal and vision is to bring policymakers into the National Space Power Center so they can see how critical the space domain is and how necessary the Space Force is to get the capabilities they need to ensure freedom of action.
Well, so what comes along with, seeing the Space Force and finding out what's needed is how big it should be, what its budget should be. And, I sometimes struggle with these questions, honestly, because space is so all-encompassing these days that it's related to virtually everything, as you just said. So it seems kind of tough for me to say, here's what the budget for space should be for the United States, because who can really even tell at this point? But how do you see that, specifically when it comes to the Space Force? How do we need to think about the money question going forward?
Yeah, I don't know if we talked about this last time we connected, but I think I talked about the inverse technological curve. where as technology increases, we should reallocate resources to new technology, because who knows what it can actually provide for us in terms of war fighting. For example, are we ever going to fight the wars we fought in the 40s again? So do we need the infrastructure for the services today that we had back then? I'd posit that we don't. And so we should use a opportunity to re-examine what we need for today. And my suggestion is, and what I would say is, the Space Force's budget needs to be on an order of magnitude about 10 times more than what it is, based on the capability that it provides. So we need to look at, can we do cost savings in other infrastructure in the Department of War, and can we move some of that resource to the Space Force?
Is there a way to do that without getting into us versus them with the other services? I would imagine other services probably wouldn't be too thrilled with what you just said.
Isn't it always an us versus them mentality? We got to get out of the us versus them. It's just us. There's just the U.S., and the U.S. needs the capabilities it needs to ensure freedom of action in every domain. All I'm saying is, can we look at reallocating those resources from other domains to ensure the Space Force has the capabilities it needs? And the question was just based on the Space Force specifically. In terms of the budget for this center that we're talking about, that's going to be a scaling approach. And so we can talk more about that as well.
Okay. You have a lot of experience, Bill, personally, in advanced space programs, joint all-domain command and control. And it's really important right now because of things like the Golden Dome, for example, the missile shield that we hear will be operational by 2028, incorporate land-based missile defense capabilities, space-based capabilities, maybe even some space-based interceptors. There could also be sea-based assets involved, as Tori Bruno from ULA has talked about, maybe having Aegis as part of this whole thing. So from kind of the command and control perspective, when you look at the scope of this project and what it's going to look to try to do, how hard is it to have just a fully functional system across land, air, sea, and especially space? Do we have technologically what we need to do that today, or is this an instance where we're kind of building the car as we're trying to drive it, so to speak?
Yeah, great question. And I would say that we've got the components and the technology that could provide a good baseline operational capability for what we're calling Golden Dome. The key is, as you said earlier, in the where the services come together in the joint all-domain or multi-domain command and control. And how that actually operates and what the operational concept looks like, that's going to be the nuance. It's going to be extremely interesting to see how it plays out. Now, I think the first chess move, or the first chess piece, has been moved, which is the assignment of General Gutlein, who is a Space Force four-star general, as the lead for this. So already we're looking at the Space Force is going to be heavily involved in the future Golden Dome architecture, going all the way back to my previous question or previous answer, where I said we need to reallocate resources to ensure the Space Force has what they need to ensure freedom of action in the domain.
Yeah. Everybody wants contracts. Companies want to make money, and they should, but a project like Golden Dome is obviously going to require a lot of companies, from traditional primes to the Andurils and Palantirs of the world, everything in between, smaller startups across the board. So specifically when it comes to space and space-based capabilities, are you seeing any different dynamics, positive or negative, in terms of how companies are willing to cooperate and coordinate on projects?
Yeah, this sitting in the Space Force Association has provided a unique perspective for the last 6 years. And, all of our job here at SFA is to advocate for a strong U.S. Space Force to ensure they have the tools necessary to do their job. As such, a lot of our corporate members are our partners in industry trying to figure out how also to help the Space Force. Interestingly, what I'm seeing is people don't realize whether or not there's a duplication of effort from a capability perspective if you look across the entire mission set of the United States Space Force. So what we're doing here at the SFA is we're working with industry to determine what the capability matrix looks like. So if we talk about a specific mission set, whether it's OPIR or missile warning or navigation warfare or satellite communications, how do you set up a capability matrix such that you know which companies are working on them, which ones are on contract, where the opportunities are for new innovative companies coming in. And then as we delve deeper into the mission sets of the Space Force, you're going to see tremendous opportunity for innovation, especially, I think, as we talked about before, this domain more than any is going to allow the service for triple use tech. You're going to see it used in commercial, you're going to see it used in civil, and you're going to see it used in national security. And so that's the new business model that folks are looking at. It's not just, hey, let's just build a service or build an entire system for the Space Force. It's let's build a system for commercial space that can be utilized in support of the Space Force needs when needed. And the example I use is in the commercial sector, no one's buying an aircraft carrier. You know, that's a single-use capability, and that's to carry aircraft and create opportunity for the maritime domain and the services. So, but in the Space Force, we will, and commercial will buy satellites for capability and then use some of that capability to support Space Force needs.
That leads beautifully into my next question, which is sort of, but given what you just said, what is the relationship with industry going forward in terms of responsibility for assets in space that are being used for multiple purposes? I mean, if you have commercial space assets, whether it's satellites or something else that are, is providing data that the Space Force either buys or uses in some other way, and they become targets in a conflict, for example, for, whether it's China or somebody else, do we have a clear understanding of how that works and who's responsible for it, who pays? Do we have to provide, military protections for certain assets in space? How does that, it seems like we're kind of confronting some of these questions they're not new questions, but they're being confronted in a new way just because of the nature of space.
You're right. And to answer your question, the short answer to your question is we still have a lot to figure out with regard to that. But it's not like we've not done it before. I mean, there's historical examples of when we have used commercial capabilities to help support warfighting needs. And so similarly, we'll have to examine what that looks like from a policy perspective. I think from a commercial side, what they're looking for is, hey, one, we want to understand that we're going to be protected, but two, please provide us a schedule such that we know what we're operating towards, because ultimately all of commercial capability is sponsored by venture capital. And so they've got quarterly reports that they got to fill. They've got, if we start slipping budgets and start slipping systems and contracts, that's an impact on commercial. So we got to provide them a schedule of services, not just policy to ensure that we protect the capabilities, but a schedule so that we can predict what that will look like, so that that VC money is continuing to pour into the commercial sector.
One more on this quickly, because I think you're in such a unique position to address this, and not to get too far in the weeds on this, but does this need to be kind of a sort of industry-wide policy written by the government that applies to everybody? I guess what I'm wondering is there the potential for companies to negotiate their own sort of terms of reimbursements or protections or for their own assets in space?
Yeah, that's a great question for the Space Force to start to try to figure out. And I suspect what's going to happen is as the Space Force starts to, and we're not going to understand all of the critical capabilities the Space Force is responsible for obvious reasons. A lot of that is hidden behind classification, which is a whole nother set of obstacles. The reality is, as they prioritize those critical capabilities they need, they could make some concessions based on how critical how they need that critical capability. And so that's going to be the interesting conversation, I think, going forward, is trying to figure out, how do we predict this? And then once we define what that capability is, what are the concessions we'll make as a service? What will the Space Force concede and say, just give us that today? Yeah. Because we need that innovation tomorrow.
Are there going to be Guardians on tours? I mean, in space, 9-month, 12-month tour. What is that? What do you see that looks like for the women and men wearing the uniform? What's the mission going to look like for them a few years down the road?
Yeah, it's funny. You can say this a number of ways. You can say a few years, and a few years means different things to different people. Let's just look 5 years from now. And again, based on what we talked about last year at Space Power, do you remember when Mr. Isaacman, before he went through his second confirmation hearing to be the administrator of NASA, what he was saying? So if you have the civil leader talking about having military capabilities and people in orbit protecting critical infrastructure. All right, well, that's a civil requirement. Let's start talking to the national security. Let's start talking to the Space Force. So I suspect in the new year, you're going to see a lot of conversation happening between this administration, the commercial sector, the civil sector, and the national security sector. And again, SFA stands uniquely positioned to ensure that the national security policy perspective is represented, and we lean forward on ensuring we can help create that policy.
Let me end with this, because I'm just always, I remember covering the Space Force in its early formative days, going back to 2019, even before that, during the debates leading up to the creation of the Space Force, and also the Space Force Association, I believe, that same year in 2019. And I'm sure you remember well that the Space Force was the subject of mockery on Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert and late night comedy shows, showing Star Wars clips and whatnot. Here we are 6 years later. I don't hear a lot of that anymore. So from your vantage point, what's this been like, this 5 or 6 year period where it seems like, maybe I'm wrong, but it's from where I sit, it seems like there really has been an understanding across all circles, including even just sort of the public at large, that this isn't a joke. This is now sort of the epicenter of U.S. national security strategy moving forward.
Yeah, now you're getting at kind of where the Space Force sits, one, in terms of importance, which I would tell you it's the most important service for the future. People just don't realize it yet. Other services are going to have to acknowledge that and probably start making some movement on how we allocate those resources. Two, we've not had a quote-unquote battle in space that we can point to. Every other domain, we've had a battle that we can point to and say, see, this was a critical moment for this type of technology. Here's what we do know. We do know the threat is moving fast. There are potential adversaries out there that would just assume take out all of our space capabilities. And if we don't move fast enough, we're going to be outpaced by our potential adversaries. And so I think it's starting to resonate more with our policymakers. I think they're starting to understand it, going all the way back to the beginning. Without a demonstrator to show them what the potential impact is at the National Space Power Center, then they're not going to have a full picture.
Bill Woolf, thanks so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast. Really appreciate your time today.
Really, thank you so much for taking time.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all listen to the show. And here we are in 2026. So my threat of the week is kind of looking forward into this year, and that's a potential backlash against artificial intelligence among the American public and what that could mean for the future of big tech or commerce or economy and really our way of life in general. Now, this was partially inspired by my own conversations with family members over Christmas, some of whom seemed to take a position on AI that straddled the line between I don't really understand it and to the extent that I do understand it, I don't like it and would prefer that it wasn't a part of my life. Now, some of this, of course, can be chalked up to generational change, right? Older people sometimes are wary of new things coming and we don't understand what younger people are doing, or in this case, what they're using on their phones. Guy, maybe your teenage children can explain what 6'7" means to me because I still have no idea. But when it comes to AI, this is, of course, a serious issue. A recent Pew Research Center survey found that many U.S. adults have kind of soured on AI and believe it's going to worsen their ability to form meaningful relationships. More than half of adults, the survey found, are concerned about the growing presence of AI in daily life. Another poll released by Gallup last month found that 77% of adults don't trust businesses to use AI responsibly. There was another poll from the Institute for Family Studies that found a strong majority of Americans believe states should be able to regulate AI, something the Trump administration has opposed. There are any number of other surveys, but in other words, there's a ton of skepticism out there about AI. And there's also a massive education gap, which we talked about with Elad Shulman of Lasso Security last week. A lot of people just don't understand what AI is. They don't know what a large language model is. Now, we try here in the Threat Status Podcast as to be something of a educational outlet on that, but I think more importantly, people don't realize how this is already being used in their everyday lives, whether it's Google searches, navigation in their cars, how it's helping Facebook feed them even more personalized recommendations for stuff they want to buy. As another personal example that fascinated me, I was talking to some friends over Christmas who said they're watching the show Stranger Things on Netflix, and they noticed that as they were watching, they never had any spoilers pop up on their phone when they're browsing Facebook or X or Reddit or the web. But as soon as they finished the final episode, literally like that evening, all of a sudden they started getting tons of spoilers all over their phones on a whole bunch of different apps and sites. That kind of thing is going to become really common in the age of AI. All of our accounts and devices communicating in ways we sometimes don't understand, doing things that it thinks we want, but that maybe becomes scary or maybe even kind of creepy in some ways. And that's not even getting into the notion that jobs could be lost because of AI, although that's a trickier thing to quantify. But regardless, the point is, what happens if the backlash gets worse? Will the government have to get more aggressive or change its tack? Are we looking at a major downturn in public favorability for tech firms and venture capital outfits developing and funding all of this AI that it seems a lot of people don't want and don't understand? I don't know the answer to that, Guy, but I think we're entering 2026 at kind of a pivotal moment here. And it's my thread of the week because I do think there's a universe where this could lead to some borderline unrest in American society.
Borderline or sweeping. Your reference, Ben, to holiday discussions with friends and family brings to mind my own mother's response to AI, which is that the time has come for people to take a few minutes to do some Tai Chi and take a walk in the woods. Certainly food for thought there. Meanwhile, Ben, my own thread of the week is simply that AI-generated videos are becoming more and more real, and they're saturating social media around the world in a way that is literally altering the perception of reality that human beings share with each other. I bring this up within the context of a major report out in recent days by a group of NATO scientists. Yes, Ben, there is something called the NATO Science and Technology Organization, and it put out a NATO chief scientist research report titled, quote, Cognitive Warfare, end quote, that homes in on technological advancements, namely AI and social media, that have made it easier for rogue actors on the world stage to, quote, manipulate human cognition, exploiting the complexities of human behavior, end quote. The report says the digital information environment amplifies the potential to mislead and disrupt societies, from citizens to military leaders. My thread of the week, Ben, is that AI-generated videos are getting more real, and that could be very dangerous, particularly if such videos end up intentionally or accidentally triggering a major war of some kind.
It's amazing when you think about even, last year at this time here in the podcast, talking about where we were with AI versus where we've come in 12 months. And if that trend continues exponentially upward, as it seems like it's going to, where we'll be at the end of 2026 is hard to even fathom, I think, in a lot of ways. So thank you for that. A huge thanks, of course, to Bill Woolf of the Space Force Association for that fantastic interview. And most of all, a huge thanks to all of you, our listeners. Thanks for joining us here at the outset of 2026. Share the show with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.